Hello. So today we are going to be looking at the work of Akili Membe, who is an African theorist, philosopher, and very central to the thinking of theory from the global south. He has a vast array of work that has contributed, one, to looking at theory from the global south, but also to reworking some of the central concepts in what is regarded as Western social theory. So let's take a look at some of his work. He has a vast array of work, so we won't be able to go into all of it, but I'm largely hoping to give a short introduction to his book on the post-colony and then go on to his most widely read essay titled Necropolitics. Alright, so there are three core ideas that Membe would say that he has worked with or he continues to work with, and these are personhood, reason, and now more recently the planet. In terms of personhood, his work investigates what constitutes becoming a human subject. When is a person's life relevant? When is it not? When is someone regarded as a human, as a subject? And when are they regarded as a thing, as an object, to be controlled, to be studied, and so on? So that trajectory in Western thought is something that as a philosopher his work has focused on. The other aspect of Western theory, Western social theory that his work focuses on is the idea of reason. The idea of reason and the weight that it has in Western social theory, and that Membe would argue is the framework within which Western social thought exists. And so to look outside it, outside that particular version or frame of reason becomes almost an impossibility for Western social theory. His more recent work has looked at and continues to look at the notion of the planet that we all inhabit and ways of mutual inhabitation in terms of inhabiting with difference between species and amongst humans. Membe was born in Cameroon in 1957. 3 years after which Cameroon became the Republic of Cameroon, gaining independence from France. And so Membe has seen the transition of his native country from being a colony to being a post-colony. And through his observations, he states that despite becoming an independent nation state, the post-colony retains the reliance on violence. So despite freedom, violence continues. And this observation then paves the way for many of his studies and many of his philosophical inquiries. He went on to study in France, where he did his PhD in political science and philosophy, and then has held teaching positions in the United States, and more recently he is in South Africa. And his theory has also widely traveled across various continents and has informed French critical thought and post-colonial theory to a large extent, even though he would refrain from calling himself a post-colonial scholar. But his subject of investigation is the post-colony. Then his 2003 essay, Necropolitics, was published in the journal Public Culture, and eventually he's gone on to develop it further, but I'm presenting the 2003 version in today's lecture. His other work, Critique of Black Reason, Brutalism, Out of the Dark Night, and the Earth Community, see the transition of his work from looking at largely the notion of personhood, who constitutes the human subject, to looking at the sort of amalgamation of reason and violence. And then his more recent work, as you can see, the Earth Community, looks at possibilities of co-inhabiting the planet. I'm going to begin with his work on the post-colony, and in his work on the post-colony, he basically asks how Western social theory finds it very difficult to understand the notion of the other, to understand the notion of somebody who does not look like them, and that this difference almost becomes incomprehensible. I'll read out from his text. He writes, "The theoretical and practical recognition of the body and flesh of the stranger as flesh and body just like mine the idea of a common human nature, a humanity shared with others, has long posed and still poses a problem for the Western consciousness. Then he says, but in relation to Africa, this notion of absolute otherness, that this is us and this is them, and we define ourselves as that which is not them, right? The notion of an absolute otherness has been taken the farthest, where the African body has been stereotyped, has particular notions of being primitive, of being uncivilized, of being savage, of being somewhere behind in terms of time. The title of this chapter is Time on the Move, where Africa is seen as this static continent which is frozen in history, or perhaps even ahistorical, whereas the rest of the time moves on and Africa still has the catching up to do. So it's either portrayed as that or as completely out of history, as completely something that does not have a history. So those are the stereotypical imaginations of Africa that continue to plague the Western imagination. And one could perhaps, let's say, go back to National Geographic and the images that one sees over there of the African continent or from the African continent, that once, if one does a content analysis of those images, you would also perhaps see that there are only particular kinds of images that are presented to represent the African continent. So his critique is largely on this particular imagination about the African continent. And what does that do, right? So what does such a representation do? We know, and he writes, that social theory's legitimacy rests on its capacity to construct universal grammar. So there is a theory has to abstract, and in that sense theory has to give us a universal grammar, right? It has, we spoke about at least the pretense to universality as something that is applicable beyond just its narrow confines, is the job that social theory does. Now, when one positions the West as that time and space of progress, as the time and space of reason, as that which is civilized, whereas Africa as that which is ahistorical, chaotic, outside history, and uncivilized, then this becomes the particular and this becomes the universal. So when Africa becomes the particular, always steeped in myth, in religion, in superstition, therefore there doesn't remain a space to look at any kind of progressive thought that might be coming out of that particular continent. To that he writes, there thus arises the purely methodological question of knowing whether it is possible to offer an intelligible reading of the forms of social and political imagination in contemporary Africa solely through conceptual structure and fictional representations used precisely to deny African societies any historical depth and to define them as radically other, as all that the West is not, right? So it was this imagination that Membe argues enables, for example, the slave trade to happen, or for colonization to happen, right? So that's why an investigation of this particular imagination becomes central to investigating the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world, or the colonies and the West. In the rest of the book, in Post-Colony, he goes on to investigate how even after independence, a similar kind of an imagination is taken up by the state versus the rest, where the job of the state is to control, to civilize, and in that sense, the violence of the state does not end even with the post-colony, right? And then he does go into a lot of detail on how the post-colonial state exerts control and imagines a future for the African state. I now want to go on to presenting his essay, Necropolitics, which he starts with this understanding of sovereignty. And he writes, the essay assumes that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides to a large degree in the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Hence, to kill or to allow to live constitutes the limits of sovereignty. Its fundamental attributes. To exercise sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality and define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. So, sovereignty becomes about who is allowed to live and who can be killed or who is to die, right? So, this division of those whose lives are valuable and whose lives are disposable constitutes the domain of sovereignty, which is the domain of the state. So, he starts his essay with this assumption, like this is the central assumption that he builds the whole essay on. Does several conceptual moves, and I'm going to try and explain those in this particular lecture, and if not, I would really encourage you to read it for yourself and therefore get a more detailed understanding of what he's trying to do. He starts by looking at death, since this sovereignty is about life and death. So, death becomes a very important, tangible aspect of trying to understand life. In order to do that, he draws on the work of Hegel and Georges Bataille. From Hegel and his phenomenology of spirit, he takes the process of becoming as a relationship with nature. A relationship with nature in the sense that nature is othered in the Western context through the process of enlightenment. Once nature is othered, the human works and labors in order to transform nature to create a world for themselves. In creating that world for themselves, they deny or kill that part of themselves which is also nature. So, the animal has to die for the human subject to be born, right? So, there is death in the becoming of the spirit, death is involved, death of that part of the human that is nature. So, Hegel, about Hegel, Membe writes, the human being truly becomes a subject that is separated from the animal in the struggle and the work through which he or she confronts death, understood as the violence of negativity. Here, the violence of negativity is that where nature is constituted as the other, as the negative. So, when we juxtapose this particular understanding to race or to the stories that I told about the African continent, where the humans that reside there are seen as more animal, as seen as more nature, as those that have not conquered nature and therefore not become human subjects. Membe writes, it is through this confrontation with death that he or she is cast into the incessant move of history. So, when you are outside this notion, then you are ahistorical, right? So, that's the kind of understanding he is drawing from Hegel. But then, from Georges Bataille, he says, he has a very different understanding of death. Georges Bataille says that life itself exists only in bursts and in exchanges with death. The sovereign world is the world in which the limit of death is done away with. Death is present in it, right? Its presence defines the world of violence. But while death is present, it is always there only to be negated and never for anything but that. Now, this understanding is important because when Membe is talking about how power works, death for him is central to the way how power works. It never vanishes. The threat of it remains, the never-ending possibility of it remains. It always is constitutive of the sense of power, of the way power works. He then goes on to, he would say, supplement or expand Foucault's notion of biopower by asking that while biopower showed us how life is managed through the use of bodily functions, through the control over bodily movements, or how Foucault explains surveillance and all of that. But Membe says that biopower is not enough to understand how this relationship between life and death works in the way contemporary power works. So, Membe writes, is the notion of biopower sufficient to account for the contemporary ways in which the political, under the guise of war, of resistance, or of the fight against terror, makes the murder of the enemy its primary and absolute objective. War, after all, is as much a means of achieving sovereignty as a way of exercising the right to kill. Imagining politics as a form of war, we must ask, what place is given to life, death, and the human body? In particular, the wounded or slain body. How are they inscribed in the order of power? So this particular order of power that Membe is trying to show us as an extension of Foucault is connected to death and is connected to war. And in this particular form of war, it's not the same kind of war that you have between two equally reasonable states or two states where there would be rules of war, where there would be one winner and one loser. In this particular way he's talking about it, that which is the other is a constant threat and must be obliterated, right? And therefore that obliteration does not follow any rule, does not follow what we understand the state to be, in terms of states are supposed to have autonomy, states are supposed to negotiate with other states, states are supposed to follow the rule of law in terms of war. In the context that Membe is writing, none of that works. So when colonizer goes and has a war in the colony, the intent is to obliterate, the intent is to take over, right? The intent is not to win or lose. Then he draws upon what does that create. So this kind of obliteration or this kind of total control or domination creates what in Agamben's work has been called states of exception. Now, states of exception, the example that he draws is the most obvious one as the Nazi camp, and he quotes both Hannah Arendt and Agamben to show how the Nazi camp was the most cruel depiction of to the extent to which human reason or instrumental rationality can go in the defense or in the act of violence, right, or in the act of control, in the act of obliteration. Quoting Agamben, Membe writes, "The camp is the place in which the most absolute conditiono inhumana ever to appear on earth was realized." In the previous paragraph, he had quoted Hannah Arendt to make the same claim. And then Agamben argues that in the camp, this kind of violence acquires a permanent spatial arrangement that remains continuously outside the normal state of law. So that is why the state of exception. In the camp, law is suspended. You don't need to work through a particular reason. You don't need to work through the legally stated regulations. And in that absolute domination, one gains control. And this absolute domination is built through reason, is built through carefully practiced and developed over a long time techniques which will control and which will dominate. And this is done through terror. Sometimes, oftentimes in fact, not in the case of Nazi Germany, but in the colonies or in the plantations, it is done with the intention or the stated intention of emancipation. How is that so? Firstly, let me read out what he has to say about how power takes over in the context of a plantation and in the context of the colony. He writes, "The perception of the existence of the other as an attempt on my life." So just because somebody is the other, they are perceived as a threat. As a mortal threat or absolute danger, whose biophysical elimination would strengthen my potential to life and security. This, I suggest, is one of the many imaginaries of sovereignty characteristic of both early and late modernity itself. In order to explain this, he takes two examples. One of them is the plantation. Plantation is also kind of like a camp where it is enclosed, there is control, there is surveillance, there is disciplining, and there is violence. In terms of slavery in the plantation, these are slave plantations, sugarcane, sugar plantations, cotton plantations, and so on. Here, the slave loses a lot of rights in order to become a thing, in order to become an object through which production can happen. So, there is the loss of home, there is the loss of rights over one's body, and there is the loss of political status for the slave. But through that, what they are constituted as is a thing and a property that is owned by the slave owner and disciplined and controlled and through violence made to work in order to produce things of value. So their labor can have value, but their body and themselves and they don't have value. So they have no political subjectivity in the plantation as a slave. So there is all of this loss and lack that is justified based on the notion of imaginaries that are created about the African people as savage, in need of control, the imaginary about them being uncivilized and therefore the civilizing process is essential, and the Hegelian notion of the man transforming nature, and here nature comes to be the stand-in for the African person. In the colony also, he says the colony is the zone where the violence of the state of exception is deemed to operate in the service of civilization. And all of these, the plantation itself, for the plantation he also has a lengthy discussion drawing from Fanon on how it is spatialized through barracks which are separate in terms of those for the slaves, which will be dingy and dark and lack of spaciousness is there. There is person upon person, places of bad health, whereas those of the slave owner or the plantation owner. Similarly, in the colony, you see the spatial division between the settlers in the white town and the natives in the black town. And this division then creates possibilities of control. So it is in these sites, he argues, in the colony with this spatial segregation and in the plantation with its own unique architecture, where the techniques that eventually were used in Nazi Germany were perfected. So a whole instrumental rationality was developed, where he argues one did not then need to think about the consequences or the inhumanity associated with one's actions, because one was only acting based on a particular reason, based on a particular rationality that was presented as a set of methods, as a set of techniques, as a set of orderings in the quest towards civilization, in the quest towards a certain idea of progress and otherness. Similarly, in apartheid in South Africa, he says a similar spatial logic took place where the homeland and the town created two distinct spaces within the same city or the same country, enabling two very different kinds of lives that become possible, or enabling the distinction between that whose life is valued and that whose life is dispensable, but also creating a whole economy where black people's labor could be exploited, where black people were not allowed to own property, could only sell their labor at very reduced wages, and were always subject to control and surveillance. So he writes, colonial occupation itself was a matter of seizing, delimiting, and asserting control over a physical geographical area, of writing on the ground a new set of social and spatial relations. The writing of new spatial relations, that is territorialization, was ultimately tantamount to the production of boundaries and hierarchies, zones and enclaves, the subversion of existing property arrangements, the classification of people according to different categories, resource attraction, and finally the manufacturing of a large reservoir of cultural imaginings of sovereignty. So all of that, he's like really speaking to us about how spatial division also overlaps with the social division and how hierarchies and orders are constructed alongside imaginations, right? So that is the story he's trying to narrate through the colony, through the plantation, through Nazi Germany, through apartheid, and various other processes where the possibility of who gets to live and who is let die or let live becomes a part of the sovereign's task. Towards the end, he says that three things come together. he says biopolitics comes together with states of exception, but it also in contemporary warfare comes together with the state of siege. The state of siege is the total occupation. In the state of siege, here he uses the example of the occupation of the West Bank, and in that he says there are other architectures or techniques of control that are being used. One of them, for example, is territorial fragmentation, where you demarcate areas similar to an apartheid, where the Palestinians can stay, where Israelis can stay. So you divide up the population and you assign particular areas. Violence becomes a central form of control. Things like bulldozing, infrastructural warfare, and this he says is a technique of contemporary warfare, of going ahead and destroying the enemy's means of living, or that which is essential to sustaining life, like roads and bridges, electrical stations and so on. And he adds another concept, and that is that he calls vertical sovereignty, where he says it is not just operating on a territory, it is operating at multiple levels. It is operating underground, maybe through control over resources, mineral resources. It is acting on the territory through division, but it is also acting in air. And so along the y-axis, there is also division, not just of space, but also of people. So who gets to occupy the higher ground, who gets to be on the lower ground, how power acts, how violence is exerted through top-down tools and techniques and equipments is something that he says is characteristic of late modernity's occupation and contemporary techniques of warfare. I will end by reading out two of his quotations from the same essay, Necropolitics. He writes, "Sovereignty means the capacity to define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not." Right? So he again comes back to sovereignty, and through these various examples shows how sovereignty actually is about whose life is important or to be saved and whose life can be done away with. And that is another thing he says in modern warfare. He says largely modern contemporary warfare is not looking at the enemy or going and attacking the enemy, but large swaths of population are considered to be enemy, and that he says is unique and not consistent with what we have known so far as the rule of law. Late modern colonial occupation is a concentration of multiple powers. So there is disciplinary power, who can move, there's mobility is controlled, who has to stay in place, who can do what, when, all of that. The biopolitical, so there's surveillance, and the necropolitical, which is to do with the question of life and death itself. So with that, I'm going to end today's lecture. See you in the next. Thank you.